Greetings, and welcome back to another discussion. Today, we are joined by our resident expert-in-chief on all matters genetic, or at least some matters genetic, Tane Caledon. We're going to be talking about some of the politics involved in the, you could say, free market craze of DNA tests and genetic testing, and really how people interpret the results and how it's sort of affected society in the last couple of years. I'll say at the outset that the interesting thing I've noted, and there are data on this, is that DNA tests, for example, the popularity of them has increased about 100% in the last 2 or so years. And so it shows that there's this tremendous interest in that sort of thing. And the way I look at it, before I hand over the podium to Tane, is that there really are sort of two polarized sides, where you have the purity spiraling of the far right, or whatever, the sort of the alt-right, and then the left-wing people who, you know, the more mixed you are, the greater your glory, and just a kind of weird interpretation of the data based on all of that. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that the increase in popularity is somewhat to be expected. When you talk to your average person on the street, I don't think that they've really bought as much as the people in the interview that kind of led up to this. Somebody who's got like the older mindset might think that we didn't really talk about the thing that we're talking about, did we? The interview. Sorry.
The interview on the Canadian Talk program, or
that's right. I was.
Well, we can just. I should mention it. So one of the reasons I should mention this, the discussion was prompted because Steve Palkin, this Canadian guy, runs this show called The Agenda, usually about a half an hour format, and you had two people. One was, in my interpretation, okay with these sorts of things and sort of exploring human biodiversity, and the other guy, I believe he was a lawyer specializing in genetics, as it were. Incidentally, he was the white guy, and the other one was, I guess, the token Asian. I think she was Korean. And he was very sort of worried about people reading too much into it or what have you. So that's how, at least some of the inspiration for this talk, anyway.
Right. And one of the things that they touched on, or that the host tried to get them to touch on, was that an age differential between the older white man who had dealt with genetics for all of his life as the Human Genome Project was developing, and revelations about what we are were coming out. The narrative that he would put forth, which he strongly emphasizes, that there are no differences on average really between people. He talks about variations within populations, things that are true, but there's a strong emphasis against a certain racialized narrative, which is that's fine. That's owed to him. But the younger person doesn't really have the same care for what people would do with the information, and I think that that's because most people who've been handed down this information don't really have the same political motives to unless they find themselves on the radical left, to reject out of hand the type of racism that they weren't exposed to in the context of having no factual information to back up one statement or another. So people who grew up where racial politics was kind of a one-way street in terms of who was going to be on the right side of history and who was going to be writing it, versus people who have new information and a chance to maybe take a look at some of those old issues again. And so the rise in popularity is shocking to the lawyer guy, because he sees it as a closed issue. He's worked with the science. He was part of the group, you could say, that was sending down the narrative to the new generation, and he's disturbed that what they want from it is a sort of racialized interpretation that he thought had been done away with by the work he was involved with.
Yeah, or otherwise maybe he's become aware that that's not the case. Otherwise he wouldn't have been on that show, The Agenda, to talk about it, because he was constantly expressing his concerns, whereas the other woman, the Korean woman, her name was was saying, well, I don't see any problem with that. And she was saying the same thing applies to sex differences. But there's no doubt in my mind that there is, on the left, an agenda, a kind of, discover your roots. I've seen one of these ads or commercials for, I think, Ancestry.com. It's one of the many tests available, where some woman discovers she has, I don't know, her the regions in her SNPs which correlated with a quote-unquote Native American population. Let's put it that way.
Right. As many Americans do.
Yeah, and then it was like 20%, and she just started, saying how she began exploring her background. She had no connection to it before, anything like that, and was obsessively pursuing that. Oh, I had no idea that blah, 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 blah. And that seems to be a very sort of left-wing angle to promote things with. And the other thing I don't know how true this is. If it is true, it's completely unprofessional. But I believe it's 23andMe that was claiming that sometimes they would slip in tiny slivers of sub-Saharan African people that otherwise had none, just to sort of throw off the alt-right or something like that. So, if you were...
Yeah, I saw the article about that. I never found the source underneath.
No.
It was a rumor.
It would literally be professional misconduct. So it seems very unlikely, but if that is the case, then, I mean, that's pretty shocking, and obviously is an agenda-driven thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in some sense, the lawyer guy is correct. I mean, it's not only possible, but it is the case that getting your results from a bunch of SNPs can allow for an overinterpretation of the data and making it more meaningful than it actually is. Because as much as you can be part of a continuum, a mean within a population, at the end of the day, you're not that mean. So I wouldn't say I'm sympathetic so much as he has valid points in a technical sense.
Yeah, he also downplays the value that you get as an individual. So he touches on a little bit what we did in our first talk, and where we said it's a bit of a party trick, that the value of these is very little outside of what you get in terms of an identity group. And obviously, what he would see as positive from that is very little, and very negative if people overanalyze and decide that that this is a measure of purity.
Yeah. And definitely you can see, in the alt-right thing, there, basically, doing these tests, the more Northwestern European you are, the more pure and holy you are. And on the other hand, I've seen people do this too. I've known people, discover some smidgen of something, and all of a sudden they're intrigued and want to discover their quote-unquote ancestry and completely change their lifestyles in response and everything. It's bizarre.
It's a little overblown, but I think that would be the lesser of two evils.
Well, okay, so what are the two evils on the table then?
Well, the two evils would be to look at these SNP-based tests and to say, on one hand, that this is a measure of absolute purity, that people who are not Northwestern European enough, based on these SNPs, based on these methods at this time, versus somebody saying, oh, well, I've got, on the other hand, ancestry that I didn't know about, and so I now identify as that group. But both of it could be toxic depending on where those people are in relation to the others in society. In one case, they would start to turn their nose at people who were less pure, and in the other case, they might find their allegiances shifting towards parties or demagogues that would better appeal to their minority status.
Well, yeah, but that's the thing. From say the alt-right perspective, the more pure the better, at least in a certain direction. And the other side, that if you're too pure, that's probably a bad thing, unless of course you're pure Native American or African or whatever else might be redeemed as okay. But the thing that I have trouble wrapping my head around is that it's obviously no coincidence that a lot of this is being discussed at a time when identity politics is just, I guess you could argue, has always been big, but it's just huge. Everything is sort of identity politics. And I think we have to, even if we're hyper individualistic, as I know I am, just kind of for whatever reason, whether it's it's obviously a mixture of genes and environment, and you seem pretty individualistic too, that most people aren't like that. And then I worry about everything being dominated by identity politics. But I also, unlike say Mr. Peterson, I don't think it's enough just to say you just got to be an individual, because arguably most people aren't individuals. They try to identify with a group, be it political, ethnic, both. Even in weird groups like furries or wherever the hell they are.
And the large enough ones vote.
Yeah. That's. I think that's really that's the challenge. I think that people like you and I face is, on the one hand, you have to acknowledge that people tend to cluster around group identities. They look for that kind of inclusivity, and then they kind of latch onto it, and they don't really want to let go of that. And then there are other people that are more individually tuned who just don't find that very appealing, but those people such as ourselves tend to be in the minority. And
well, you could argue that both of these types of people are, at the end of the day, purchasing these tests for fun, or regardless of how much stock they put into it, people are curious.
Oh, well, yeah, and there's nothing wrong with being curious. I mean, I'm curious too. I find population genetics interesting from a purely sort of intellectual standpoint. It's just interesting to observe. But I think he didn't spell it out loud, the lawyer guy. But you could hypothesize some future scenario. I'm not saying this can come true, and we would hope that it wouldn't. Where as genetic testing becomes more and more precise, and you mentioned that SNPs are not the only way to do it. Maybe they have more accurate ways, or just more efficient ways.
Let's say we have computers that could easily churn through genetic data that were like your saliva sample, but this time it gives you everything. And It's uploaded to a computer, compared with everyone, and they're improving the data all the time, and they give you email updates when they've got new information, new findings.
Right. And then some scenario where, this is obviously at this stage fantasy, but some sort of government, which is a sort of purity spiraling ethnic government where people have to meet a certain criterion of basically population genetic overlap or something like that. And if you that's going to be arbitrary, maybe it's 75% of whatever. And those people who don't meet that are, excluded, or even worse in some cases. And there's some,
or maybe the other way. People they start disregarding regional markers altogether, and say if we move past that computationally and feasibly, then we could have governments pushing people out who don't have certain traits or combinations of them.
I mean, that's actually an excellent point. You could have a kind of phenotypic paradigm that roughly corresponds with a genotype, which may or may not be independent of a certain population, and they just say, well, you don't meet the phenotypical criteria, whatever your genotype is, and we're going to have to ship you off someplace, or you'll have to voluntarily leave. I mean, these are admittedly kind of nightmare scenarios, but they're not impossible given the technology. And if people in the past had access to this type of technology of discovering, who was who and who was pure and whatever, it could have been even worse than some of the events that took place in the past. And I definitely, that's a concern that the lawyer, clearly, he doesn't say it out loud, but he has, and I think it's understandable to some degree. On the other hand, the data are out there, and it's not going to slow down. We're going to discover more and more of this stuff as time goes by. We're going to discover, as you pointed out, at the very least, genotypic correlations with phenotype, and what do you do with that? I mean, my thing is, I would say, you don't really radically change anything, because that's when you kind of move into muddy territory. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
I would just say, like, maybe the most generous interpretation of his concerns might be that, say if we just go by the technologies we have today, and every person in America were to, or any other country, Europe, whatever, were to suddenly buy one of these kits and have that information, would it be a sort of Pandora's box that we can't go back from? Would it catalyze a sort of political identitarianism that wouldn't have been there and can't go away after people know?
Yeah, but I think that's part of the issue. The genie is kind of out of the bottle, because these tests are hugely popular, and
right, but not everyone popular. I think that's why they're alarmed at the rise.
Yeah, but they do update and provide, when they can, quote unquote, health information, although it tends to be pretty scant and limited. So, yeah, I mean that this is going to grow, I think, exponentially as time goes by. It might be a kind of unofficial standard procedure that people just engage in over time. And then there are things like CRISPR technology on the horizon, which, who knows when that will go mainstream. Or
go get your genes tested, and then next thing you know, you're getting ads for a hot new CRISPR modification that you could you could implement.
Yeah, like tired of your mud eyes. Tired of your mud eyes? Well, CRISPR technology allows germline editing, so your offspring don't have to suffer the same fate as you. They'll have those beautiful baby blues, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. And here, I think I'm curious. Obviously, it's a question of time and a matter of how much geneticists understand. But assuming it is just a matter of time, once complex polygenic traits are understood, and as well as the sources, the correlative genes or alleles, like for example, let's take something like height or eye color, which that can give you a certain advantage in life, a minor one. Certainly, height is correlated with greater income.
Mm-hmm.
People, and of course, intelligence is the big one, obviously, which is much more complicated. But how will people react when that becomes available? And if they do have that as available, and what parent wouldn't want their children to be as smart as possible if they can afford it? And so this creates a kind of cascading effect, theoretically speaking, where the people who already had genetic advantages, they had high IQ and therefore had higher income, etc., gain even greater advantages down the line. And I'm not trying to be too science fiction-y here, but at some point in time when this becomes possible, which I think will happen within the next century. I think that's being conservative, but would you disagree that within 100 years this type of technology would be possible?
It's probably possible now.
Right.
But
We just don't understand all the associations, say, with intelligence in this particular case.
Right.
So yeah, people, and so the gap will widen between the haves and have-nots, be it the ones who genetically won the lottery, as well as the sort of material environmental consequences of that. And we already have what I call a great cognitive gap in society between people who are on one end of the bell curve, who are doing things that other people just can't do. I mean, I hate to include you, but you're a pretty big brain nibba. Not everyone could do the things that you're doing. And what people don't understand is the smarter you are, the more you can make use of your environment, take advantage of it, and educate yourself. So, and then if you're some guy with a 90 IQ or an 80, you're not going to be able to do that much, and you probably won't have the income to take advantage of some of these technologies. And even if there's a trickle-down effect down the line, in the same sense as the free market cell phones, blah de blah, that by the time it hits the lower classes, it'll be too late, because the people who had already been able to take advantage of the technology when it was very expensive and rare in terms of accessibility will have already made those leaps, and the gap will further widen. And that's actually a concern I have, because my argument's always, even if you don't care about people in general, and specifically people outside of your, you could say your phenotype in some sense, because people like you and I guess the cognitive elite represent a kind of phenotype. Huge disparities in cognitive capacity and therefore wealth can lead to a lot of volatility and huge instability, which who knows what the result of that might be, if you get my drift.
I do. But I think one thing I would put forward is that people don't, like it, we've talked a lot about how people don't generally, like in the public, know about genetics in a very technical sense. Mm-hmm. And I guess the question is, like, if any of this stuff was to become allowed to be commercially sold, what ethics would be imposed upon what you have to tell people, or what level of marketing you're allowed to employ? Because if somebody doesn't have a basic understanding of genetics, then what's to really stop them from choosing the option of having somebody else's genes spliced with their own for their offspring? And what really is there to stop humanity in general from trending towards a few different phenotypes, but vastly narrowing its scope? Like, I really don't think it would become haves and have-nots, because everything, if the have-nots are, disabled as they are and ignorant as they are, then what tools do they have to fight the haves, selling them technologies they don't understand, with implications that genetically remove these people anyway?
Yeah, I don't. That's an interesting way of looking at it. So you're saying that if in this theoretical scenario, the have-nots are they're unaware, not even capable of grasping the technologies involved, and so over time, the phenotypes that they represent just sort of disappear. They
disappear because they're going to be subject to a market which offers them technologies, the implications of which they can't understand, and the offspring that they have with these products, that they choose, may be less and less their own.
Yeah, I definitely could see that, and so you kind of have a natural, sort of squeezing out of the have-nots, and as they sort of morph in time into at least a greater approximation of the haves.
That's right.
Yeah, I guess, but that might take a while, and I still think my point, I would defend it, is valid in the sense that before you got there, as long as gene editing and technology remains an expensive prospect, that people will be taking advantage, the people who can understand this stuff. Mm-hmm.
There'll certainly be a very well-off group that becomes much more well-off, yes. Assuming this technology is implemented successfully. Then they'll be way out ahead.
Yeah, there might be, I think, governmental barriers. I think the government would have a vested interest in making sure it only, pertains to health. But what if in a cognitively advanced society, something like low IQ is effectively regarded as a disease? So if you have a 75 IQ in our current society, you're so disadvantaged and so incapable of even basic things like reading, writing, arithmetic, theoretically, as it correlates to those. They
basically do treat you like you have a disease.
Yeah. So maybe in that case, if there were some kind of modification technology, that would be appropriate. But after a certain threshold, it wouldn't be. It seems to me a very, very tricky thing is how people, the government, would navigate this stuff. But based on my knowledge of the interaction of, say, drugs and sports, be it using peptide hormones like insulin or HGH, or steroid hormones like testosterone and other things, it seems that people will try to take advantage of this stuff for the sake of advancement.
For personal gain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, because here's the thing. I don't know the details, but I would assume that S&P tests testing for sort of regional overlap or correspondences, there's no government interference there, because it's not, you're just finding something out, really, and it may or may not.
Yeah, I don't know of any. I don't know of any governments interfering with this yet. I mean, although they may, because it's an emerging trend, and they're known to be a little slow.
Right, but if let's say 23andMe, well, I don't think they would be the ones to do it, but let's just say because they're the most popular. They're incidentally not that great as far as the standards of the industry are concerned, but they market themselves well. They say, well, we can now offer genetic modifications. I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't let that just go through. Although
somebody would step in, because you can't do that type of human experimentation.
But then again, is there a parallel? And as a geneticist, I'd ask you that people regularly engage in government-free, interference-free plastic surgery. Now that does nothing to the level at the level of the genome. It's completely cosmetic, but nonetheless, it can create the illusion of things that of a phenotype that actually isn't associated with your genotype, and that seems okay. People, if you have the money and you can get a rhinoplasty, then go for it, right?
If we develop all of the specialized techniques and equipment and make it sufficiently available that some private company could reproduce it elsewhere, where there's no watching eye of the government, then you've basically it'll vary in price. That's the only variable left to decide. You it will happen somewhere. Somebody, it just what's it called? All that really changes is who can afford it.
Yeah.
Unless the governments of the world united, but
yeah. I mean, we're obviously just sort of engaging in guesswork here, but
right.
If you wanted to give a reasonable projection for the next 10 years or so, not some 50 years from now, the state of affairs, but in the next 10 years, what do you think is going to happen? A, in terms of these genetic tests, B, in terms of public knowledge about genetics, and C, in terms of actual genetic modification, as CRISPR-Cas9 kind of is finally let out of the bottle.
I imagine with the last question, CRISPR-Cas9, we'll see many cases going forward, and probably an increasing use, if only in the specialized case of rare genetic diseases. And then, as public knowledge goes, I think that genetics become more and more relevant to the study of biology, and so people learning about biology naturally should learn more about genetics and the advances we've made. As quickly as we've made them, it will eventually be caught up with the public to a certain degree, unless, I don't know. I would hope that everything goes well and people learn learn a little bit about it. And with the tests, you probably will, like I said, get more comprehensive knowledge out of them as the computation becomes more sophisticated and cheap. And you might see things like your updated your updated information become exponentially more valuable to the individual, such that more and more people will buy in.
Do you think that a change in education might accompany this, in the sense that people already learn in basic biology about cells and mitochondria and maybe nucleotides or whatever, but an official genetic education will be part of a normal curriculum?
Well, if people are offered gene technologies, I would think it would be the responsibility. And like I said, the way everything is going, to understand certain advances in science that, like CRISPR, for example, if that becomes an important medical technology, and the understanding of CRISPR and other similar technologies for the implementation of genetic engineering, that if that becomes a common practice, then you'd expect that the public would have an interest in knowing about it and having their children know about it, so that when they have to deal with it in life, just as a matter of public interest, they would know.
Yeah, and I think because of that, we might see a sort of reshuffling of what's important in school as far as subject matter, and even getting rid of some subjects that are regarded as maybe obsolete. Although, on the other hand, given the nature of bureaucracy, I'm not sure how quickly some of these things could be done away with.
Yeah, it might take a few generations if people are holding on to their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's deemed that history is useless at some point in time, and some history teacher, the poor bum, he doesn't want to be fired, so obviously he's going to, appeal to his union and cling to his job because it's a matter of survival, even if...
Well, there are an entire class of those people.
Yeah. I mean, I'd argue that history is never useless if you actually understand it and its relationship to the present, but increasingly, I think we live in a world that's dominated by a sort of pragmatic education, especially your generation or the generation sort of Z and onwards are they're very aware that the decisions you make in terms of education can be extremely costly if you make the wrong decisions. Like getting a history degree and being 100K in the hole for that versus, because I know people like that, versus getting a degree in molecular biology that will lead to somewhere, or code or programming or whatever. And so this might be part of a general shift towards a much more pragmatic type of education where things that used to be regarded as useful are not. I can give you an example. I mean, one thing I've noticed, I made a video about this, is that there's definitely been a trend away from humanities as kind of de facto useless. I could make arguments as to why it's not, but in the current economic climate and the market, it is in some sense, quote unquote, useless. And so I've noticed a decline in literacy and overall ability to express oneself in certain generations. That in earlier generations of corresponding status was not the case.
So I just wanted to touch on here whether or not it would be generally advisable to increase the knowledge of the public of genetics, and whether that would correlate with an increase in the use of genetic technologies. Because as we said earlier, if somebody has a functional knowledge of genetics, they would know what they're bargaining for if they enter into any kind of contract involving the use of genetic engineering on their children. But if they don't know, and they're told a more mythologized version of how this is going to work, then they might be more likely to buy in. And so countries which more, progressively implement the knowledge about genetics may see less of their use, and then a competitive disadvantage that comes with.
Yes.
So it might not actually be helpful in the end to teach people genetics if we stand to gain by the implementation against people who might have chosen differently if they didn't know.
Yeah, and this opens up another can of worms. I was going to make a video about it separately, but maybe include it here. Maybe I can still make that video. That in the West, there's a certain code of conduct, mores, that seems to govern scientific research. And places like China don't really care about things like that. I mean, they're willing to create all kinds of botched experiments until they get it right, in a way that I think that people in the West, governments in the West, would not approve of. And the problem there is, sure, there's a potential death toll, or just a kind of toll people there, but if they can figure out some way to give themselves an advantage vis-a-vis, say, gene editing technology that is deemed, quote-unquote, immoral or unethical in the West, you're stuck in a type of prisoner's dilemma where the other guy is not playing by the official rules, and he's gaining insane advantages over you, and the only way you can level the playing field is to basically play by his rules, which would basically destroy, in some sense, the integrity of core ethical values in a Western society.
Well, I would argue that in the West, the only way you could compete with a place like China, where they have a very strong totalitarian government, which can implement these programs regardless of whether the citizenry would be in favor of them. In the West, you would need to ride on the ignorance of people. So they would have to not know better for them not to reject the use of these technologies against them in that way. So maybe people won't learn as much about genetics because it's not within the shared interests of people who would implement the the change in curriculum.
Yeah, yeah. Or, the government does something covertly and doesn't really inform. I mean, they do these things anyway. Inform people this. And I would imagine that there are going to be so many blockades on a lot of this just because of politically correct culture. It's undeniable that there are, you look at different populations, there are different means, there are different averages. Genetic information can reveal things that are not particularly appealing. For example, if a population has a much greater inclination towards something like schizophrenia or neuroticism or whatever. And yeah, that might be, of course, this is all active in the environment. Same thing with, your example would be the warrior gene. A lot of people think that you just have this gene, the Mao, M-A-O, right? And then you just you become Conan, right? But it's only in an environment that promotes basically violence and that sort. If you grow up in a nice environment, it's very unlikely that gene would be expressed in behavior, phenotypical behavior.
And what do you do with genes like that? Do you remove them from the population if you could? Because it's not necessarily a liability unless the parenting doesn't go right. And what if we have trade-offs where genes offer different results, but the amount of effort that you need to put in varies? Do we have like an optimization based on that? Do we have less parented people and more?
Well, people naturally don't want to interfere. Governments, are looked down upon when they interfere, unless there's some horrible situation.
Right, but what would people choose for themselves, and what are the implications of that?
What would people choose for themselves? I mean,
that's the question. Assuming let's say we nail down every single gene-environment interaction, and we know not only what the functional consequences of the genes that we put into our child, forgoing all claim to their genetic legacy. We just want a child that is basically an economic unit for us. Do we choose the one that has more or less demanding parenting requirements? And assuming that you've made this child largely of not your own DNA, perhaps what you'd be looking for would be less investment.
And there's another complication you just mentioned without saying it, is that pleiotropic traits, which is
right.
There are genes, I know it's acknowledged that pleiotropic, referring that one gene is correlated with multiple traits.
Right, and that's actually very understandable. I never really touched on this one before, so for your audience, I'll explain. If you're building something in biology, it might not be best to think about it as something that is like everything being simply a function of one protein. So the building of things might be done by a common set of proteins which act as tools, or certain proteins which form together as megastructures, or even proteins which pair together differentially to form different tools. And the regulation feedback mechanisms that involve these proteins could change such that you have it expressed longer, shorter, or at a different time. And this leads to functional developmental differences that if you didn't know exactly what was controlling the toolbox at the time of creation, then you might have two different results in different people where the proteins are largely the same. So it's just letting you know generally how this sort of thing could come about.
Yeah. And then you have to figure out, in specific instances, is it worth the trade-off if you do have pleiotropic effects? And I mean, in some cases it probably might be. In others, what if it turns out that in general, in terms of intelligence, there's a strong pleiotropic correlation between inclination towards heavy depression and high verbal IQ or something like that? What do you do with that? How do you even bypass that sort of thing? There are all kinds of questions that come into play that one the public, well, they're not even aware of these things to begin with, but people would have to seriously consider.
I think if you've listened to Jean-Francois Garapé on these issues, what he would argue is that giving people the choice will inevitably lead to the outcome that, like I said, by the mechanism I propose or the one he proposes, eventually you'll lose control of humanity in terms of its phenotype by a market competition for genotype.
Well, I think your proposed model seems more likely than
more short term
than at least short term.
Yeah.
Right. On the other hand, I mean, if you have any futurist inclinations, it seems that the current phenotypic model is largely insufficient, on average, for taking on the challenges of the future and the challenges that await the species down the line. There could be adaptation, such that there are phenotypic shifts that occur naturally, and arguably you could say that with the rise of the cognitive elite that already has taken place to some degree. But it might not happen quickly enough. I don't really know. I guess my argument, I had a discussion with him once before he decided to go full blood sport, was that it might be the case that a sacrifice of some sort is required, maybe a narrowing of phenotypic expression in order to shuttle the species forward, and that clinging to more natural ways of just letting things happen and then seeing what happens as a consequence, that could be insufficient as a model of progress. I'm not saying it's absolutely the case by any means, but it could be, in fact, something along those lines.
It could be. We aren't as exposed to the selective landscape, though, as we once were, because of all of the different lifelines we give to ourselves. We might make inevitable the drastic change via technology, simply because through the traditional methods, we neglected to allow selection to take place. And so we might find ourselves behind for the task at hand because we've been the one delaying.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of just guessing at what may or may not happen, but that's one thing. We've definitely we talked about this before. All kinds of people are allowed to reproduce now. That may or may there isn't real selection pressure, not really. Although I would argue that the economy that exists now does create selection pressure, and the people that succeed in it are the ones reproducing.
Largely people who have nothing to do other than to reproduce and accept whatever is offered them.
Right. That's the other end of it. You have the cognitive elites who are reproducing in a kind of strategic fashion almost. Maybe they'll pop out 1-2 children, and then they pass on the wealth and their genetic material. And the people that are basically at the bottom of the barrel, taking welfare checks, and they don't really know anything apart from playing games, watching porn, and fucking, and then having lots of children. And that. Yeah, I mean that's artificial, obviously, in the sense that they well, I don't know. I don't like to invoke R and K because it's a very imperfect overall model, but the whole kind of R strategy, that is, it can be effective if you have a dozen children. Chances are that at least a few of them will survive, even if you can't offer all of them equal investment or even a good, well-balanced investment. So I don't. But that said, these people nonetheless would not survive in the kind of economy that exists right now.
Assuming there's ever a cutoff, it could be the case that we continually make way for these people by the invention of new technologies and the access of new resources. It could just be this forever.
Yeah, I've always argued that resource management is key in the sense that everything will be relatively fine until people start losing shit. By that, their money, their food, their shelter. That's when things always fall apart. That's when there are a lot of, you could say, racial tensions and political tensions these days, but for the most part, they're pretty tame. But once people are losing crucial resources, that's when it begins to become less tame, because that's just how human beings operate. Historically, prehistorically, lost a food source or source of water, there would be a conflict, a battle, a war over that, and potentially. And this is well documented. It's part of human nature. If you can maintain the resources at a stable level, such that everyone has access to them, then I don't really you could perpetually continue what's going on now, where people may or may not like each other, but they kind of tolerate each other. I've called this tolerant society, and they just kind of ignore each other in a kind of neutral way, because everyone has enough to eat and everyone has enough money, in theory. We just need to wait for something to slip, and then there could be issues.
So in the meantime, we might.
What I'm saying is, if people from a kind of sociological or sociobiological perspective, I don't think, obviously there's no evidence to suggest that quote unquote diversity is our strength, as it's claimed. But what you can get is a kind of, again, this sort of tolerant, neutral society where people, they don't really like each other, they don't spend time with each other, they have nothing in common, but they're not going to attack each other, and there won't be direct conflict because everyone has a piece of the pie, or has enough of the pie. If you wanted to, in perpetuity, maintain something like that, then it would be important to make sure that resource allocation, it remains constant and more or less even over time, at least to the point where people wouldn't get upset. It doesn't have to be perfectly even. You can still have, the pie doesn't need to be divided by fourths, for example, or eighths even. It could, you could have uneven divisions. It's just that whatever that uneven division might be, it would need to satisfy the basic needs of people. So if you look at the lower class, I'd argue this is a model that's always existed. All they really need they need enough to eat, they need their entertainment, which they get through celebrity nonsense and porn, they have video games, and then their free time, they like to fuck and pop out babies. All of that requires arguably less investment in terms of pie slice allocation, if you want to call it that, than some high IQ big brain nibba who is potentially going to go to MIT to study computational biology to figure out how to best store, people's genomes or whatever. That's going to require more time, investment. It's a kind of random example.
Slightly more.
Right.
A little more.
So, but again, if you can satisfy the pie allocation requirements, and there probably is not, there's probably some basic formula someone could come up with. I think we could continue this in perpetuity. This very sort of lukewarm, everyone tolerates each other, but they don't really necessarily associate with each other unless they absolutely have to. Like, maybe they go to the same supermarket, and so they won't attack each other at the queue, but they're not going to say anything to each other. That's what I've seen in every major city in Europe and North America. This kind of people who aren't, I would argue, phenotypically similar to each other. Not necessarily genotype, but in terms of interests, cognitive capacity, things like that. Even hobbies, you could say, are a matter of phenotype. And they won't really associate with each other, but they'll tolerate each other up to a point, and they just move on and go their separate ways. And I think that's really the best case scenario going forward. I don't think there's going to be... I don't know what the far right or the far left really want to achieve. I'm kind of lost at this. I know that the far right wants a quote-unquote ethno-state. I'm not sure what the far left wants at this stage. It's not clear to me. Other than clamping
to me
down
either.
more. Yeah, it's very... I just don't know what they want, but they could maintain this in perpetuity. But I think there are issues of resource allocation in the current state of affairs that are important and relevant that are not contested. Things like, affirmative action. that seems like such a 90s discussion to talk about the merits of affirmative action, or maybe 80s discussion. I don't see people actually arguing these days for or against. It's just sort of, it's there.
Take it as granted.
Yes. Issues that seem a bit almost cheesy in the current year, but are still relevant. Should quote-unquote Asian Americans have to score 400 points higher than on an SAT than their black American counterparts in order to gain access to the same university education? Questions like that.
Maybe not if they submit a certificate saying that they don't have the genetic markers of other Asians.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a new game people could play. I mean, or even so, I mean, what if it turns out that, you take some test like 23andMe and you have some great-great-grandfather that had some sub-Saharan Africa, you could call yourself black. In fact, I don't know how true this is, but I've had Australians tell me that there are white people in Australia who have some minuscule, some tiny fraction of ancestry going back generations, such that it's so diluted that it's sub 10% basically, claiming benefits as Aboriginal people based on S&P results.
It wouldn't be out of line with some of the stuff I've seen.
Yeah. So you could play that game and you could run that game, and I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities. But it does seem that a lot of the core issues people used to talk about have been sidestepped, and we've all kind of settled for this lukewarm continuity. And if I'm perfectly honest, what are the alternatives at this stage other than this lukewarm tolerance and continuity? Well, just conflict, and who really wants that?
Radical, horrible conflict.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of, it might be disappointing that that's where we're at right now, but it might literally be the best thing available to us if we don't want to cause disproportionate damage and harm to people and death and destruction. Because, I mean, the price for, even if that were in the pursuit of something quote unquote noble or good, the ends might not justify the means. And objectively, people are quite okay these days. They have abundance. We all live like kings, in some sense. So,
well, through these other gene technology avenues, we might just quietly usher away whatever portion of humanity, really doesn't get along with with each other.
Yeah, we might usher away the many dickwads who play a game like Overwatch, who curse you out in the spawn room. maybe we'll get rid of those people. That might actually be beneficial. More cooperative people. That'd be interesting to see what happened there.
Check back in on Overwatch in 100 years, see if it's good.
Yeah, see if people are willing to play tank and swap. I wonder.
Maybe.
No, but I mean, obviously, I mean, it's such a kind of minute, almost banal point, but there's obviously some genetic component to a person's personality, and if you're a flex player in a game, obviously molded by environment, that's that seems to be arguably not really selected for as much as I'm going to play what I want to play. That's
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny, if you observe and tabulate all of these findings, that the DPS main has a selective advantage over the flex.
Absolutely, and some of them, if they're not going to say anything, they're very, as you personally borne witness to, quick to leap to certain expressions, such as "Shut the fuck up, man! When you ask your friend to swap," that sort of thing. Yeah, I'd say that's a very minor example, but it would be interesting to see how how these things proceed down the line. Although that would be probably a minor concern in 100 years. I'm not sure if Overwatch would still be around, but yeah.
Hope not. Imagine if nothing replaced it.
Imagine if, that's almost as horrifying as some of the apocalyptic visions I can conjure up in my head for all of humanity. Overwatch continuing for another century or so.
The energy crisis is solved. World peace is achieved. and
Yes.
the Overwatch community continues to trundle forward.
Yep. Yep. That would be quite the nightmare. But yeah, it's one of those. I look at Overwatch as a kind of defective phenotype of games that needs to die out. It's dysgenic, basically.
I hear there are coders working on technologies where they could change games.
Yeah. Well, we can only hope that they come up with something, because the current state of game, in that sense, it can't really continue.
Man.
So, would you say, in summary, that you're sort of cautiously neutral about how things are going to go forward? You're not optimistic. You're not too pessimistic, or how would you summarize your own view of the interaction of genetic technology and politics?
I feel like we're going to reach some radical conclusion that the people who are alarmed now, probably have the right to be alarmed about, but might not be as bad as we think in the end. Like that the proliferation of these types of tests, the increase in this type of technology and interest in it, the results will be felt politically, will probably have, in all ways that we've discussed, the effects on politics, personal lives, and even the development of future technologies and economies, or like the competition between nations. All of these things will be affected by these technologies, but I don't know in what way.
Yeah, impossible to know. Even a geneticist such as yourself, and it largely lies outside of our hands. So it's kind of a wait and see thing, which can be very frustrating. I think for a lot of people, at least. Which is, I think, a lot of the kind of internet LARPing is a secret desire to be sort of an activist, or at least participate in a lot of these things, because discussion only gets you so far, although it can be useful in highlighting critical issues. But beyond that, there's a feeling of impotence and just helplessness. So when all you can really reasonably say is, we just have to wait and see, that's not really a satisfying answer to most people.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I've taken up enough of the esteemed Lord Callan's time. He's got headshots to make and genes to crack, as it were. But I hope this was a kind of interesting discussion about the theoretical applications of gene technology and the politics involved. And yeah, I hope to check you out later if I'm still around. And if the topic is relevant and Tana's time, I will be sure to try to get him on again. As always, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.